Hey everyone, welcome back to Stellar HFY. First off, thank you. The support on our last galactic war story was incredible, and it's clear these are the battles you love exploring. Today we're diving into one of humanity's most chilling victories. An alien armada storms into Sol, and only Wreckage ends up circling their own homeworld. Let's jump straight into the fight. Confirm contact! Commander Duran Voss snapped, his voice cutting through the tension in the Aegis Spire command room. Warning klaxons wailed against the reinforced walls, and red status lights pulsed like a heartbeat in crisis. Officers bent over their stations, fingers flying across console keys, while the main heads-up display flooded the bunker with cold light. A ripple appeared at the heliopause, distant but unmistakable. Ships breaking interstellar dark, bending trajectories toward Sol. Multiple signatures, the sensor chief called, his tone tight. Estimate 50 capital hulls, hundreds of escorts. That's the Velari main fleet. The air in the bunker felt heavy, dry with recycled ventilation, tasting faintly of oil and metallic dust. Duran's hands curled behind his back, the movement deliberate to mask the tremor in his fingers. He had known this day was coming. 3 months ago, the first colony had gone silent, then the second. The third message was a raw fragment, a half-burned transmission of screaming and static, before it ended in a bright pulse that their long-range observatories recorded as a debris cloud. Casualties ran into millions. He could still see the names scrolling across memorial feeds when he closed his eyes. The planetary governments had hesitated, each one expecting the next system to hold the line. Instead, the Velari crushed everything they touched, methodical and unstoppable. Their strategy had been surgical: destroy orbital industry, leave survivors scattered and terrified. Humanity had been forced into retreat, pulling every remaining asset inward toward Earth. Tracking confirms formation shift, the tactical officer reported. They're moving in a spearhead pattern, slow, confident, like nothing out here can stop them. Duran leaned closer to the display, studying the pattern. The aliens had learned from prior contact: tight defensive screens, layered escorts, staggered advance. He could imagine the cold logic of their commanders, another primitive species, caged in its home system, ready to be harvested or erased. A soft shiver passed down his spine, not from fear, but from recognition. He had spent a year studying their maneuvers, memorizing every standard deviation in their orbital war doctrine. Project Epitaph had been born from those observations. It wasn't a fleet or a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a trap woven from sacrifice. Mining stations had been stripped of their crews and retrofitted with kinetic launchers. Civilian freighters had been hollowed out, leaving skeletal frames packed with decoys and reflective panels to create false profiles. Orbital platforms had been abandoned, left to drift in positions that only appeared random. Each one was a piece of a puzzle designed to lure the invaders deeper. The plan demanded more than engineering. It demanded blood. Some facilities couldn't be evacuated in time. Some crews had volunteered to stay long enough to finish the modifications before catching last-minute shuttles to Luna or Earth. Duran had forced himself to watch their departure through the command network, each grainy video feed capturing faces that knew they might not live to see the plan unfold. He called up the archived footage now, not for tactics but for weight. A transport lifting from a Martian refueling platform, dust kicking into the thin sky, engines roaring in short bursts. The camera inside the hold shook with turbulence as miners huddled shoulder to shoulder, faces drawn tight. One man gripped a small metal lunchbox to his chest as if it were a lifeline. A younger technician, helmet in her lap, whispered something that the feed didn't catch before the connection cut to static. "Commander?" A junior comms officer spoke softly, breaking into his memory. "Outer relay confirms. Velari fleet is officially in system. They're broadcasting encrypted pulses. Direction vector, Mars first, then Earth." The room seemed to still for a moment, the way air stills before a storm breaks. Duran straightened, letting the weight of command settle on his shoulders. He was not a hero, not in the way storybooks painted them. He was a man who had traded sleep for calculations, who had turned grief into cold equations. Every life lost on the frontier was carved into the logic of Epitaph. "Maintain dark network protocols," he ordered. His voice carried the finality of steel. Do not challenge them. Let them come. The senior sensor officer hesitated. Sir, letting them destroy Mars means... I know what it means. His gaze flicked to the feet of Mars, its rust-red curves scattered with artificial lights that would soon become target markers. This is the only way we can win. Every hour they move deeper, every kilometer they believe is safe, brings them closer to the knife. A low vibration carried through the floor as the spire's internal locks sealed, isolating command from the world above. The faint tang of recycled air clung to Duran's tongue, a reminder that they would live and die in this room until the operation concluded. He walked past the banks of consoles, the glow from the heads-up displays painting his uniform in sterile light. His officers avoided his eyes, but he saw the tension in their jaws, the way hands gripped the edges of desks until knuckles whitened. Update from Mars Orbital, the tactical officer said after a beat. Civilian tugs are pulling the last decoy freighters into position. Automated mining arms are primed. Final confirmation code. Incoming. Now. On the central display, the alien fleet appeared as cold white symbols drifting toward the inner system, unhurried and certain. Behind them, their slipstream wakes shimmered like the echoes of a predator. Duran exhaled slowly. Mark the approach. Project Epitaph begins the moment they cross Mars orbit outside. Space gave no sign of the coming storm, but in Aegis Spire, the room tightened with a shared understanding. Earth's first and last line of defense was about to be tested, and the fate of their species would be decided in the shadows of their own sun. They've reached Mars orbit, the sensor officer's voice cracked, breaking the tension in Aegis Spire. Red light spilled across the command floor as the laser plasma displays tracked the alien fleet in sharp arcs. Each symbol represented a Valari warship sliding into firing range. Duran Voss leaned forward, the recycled air in the sealed bunker cold against his skin. His knuckles pressed into the console edge until they ached. The first strike came like the swing of an executioner's blade. A flash burst across the heads-up display as kinetic slugs ripped through Mars' primary shipyard. The feed from the orbital camera stuttered before locking onto the destruction. Habitat rings twisted and snapped, scattering glowing fragments that tumbled against the planet's rust-colored horizon. Cargo modules ruptured, flinging debris and bodies into space. For a heartbeat, silence filled the bunker, broken only by the faint hum of electronics and the clipped breathing of the crew. Impact confirmed, the tactical officer said, voice tight. Multiple civilian casualties. Transmission cut. Duran forced himself to watch the delayed feed. A worker in a red suit clung to the exterior scaffolding, tether snapping as the shock wave tore through the structure. He spun silently into darkness before the camera feed went dead. The human cost landed like a physical blow. His throat tightened, but his voice stayed level. Maintain dark network. They can't know we're watching. The Valari fired again. Their destroyers moved methodically, every strike deliberate, ripping apart the smaller habitats that had not been cleared in time. Fire blossomed across the planet's shadowed limb as oxygen tanks ruptured and solar arrays shattered. On the far side of Mars, plumes of dust rose as fragments rained against the thin atmosphere. Sir, they're sweeping the orbit clean, the sensor chief muttered. They're thorough. They think it's over, Duran said quietly. He felt the weight of the miner's last transmissions pressing at the edge of his memory. This was the moment he had trained for. Cold calculation over instinct. Epitaph Stage 1. Initiate tracking. The command spread through secure channels, unseen and unheard by the invaders. Across the belt between Mars and Earth, dormant mining arms uncoiled from abandoned stations. Cameras swiveled to lock onto Valari hulls, their optical surfaces coated in frost after months of silent drift. In the asteroid field beyond Phobos, drone pods warmed their guidance systems, invisible against the background, until the first pulse of stored power flickered within their cores. A junior officer whispered from his station, Do we answer them at all? Duran shook his head slowly. We let them think they own this orbit. Fear breeds mistakes. The aliens obliged his plan. Confident and unchallenged, the Valari fleet fanned out, carriers positioning themselves above Mars' equator. Smaller escorts broke formation to deploy skirmishers, disc-shaped drones that spun away in wide arcs, sweeping debris with cold efficiency. Their movements were clean, practiced, the habits of a force that had crushed a dozen weaker species without ever facing equal resistance. Skirmishers on intercept path, the tactical officer noted, fingers darting across the console. Their sweep is starting. The drones clip through the broken shipyard, shredding the remaining metal with laser cutters, clearing lines of fire for the main fleet. Sparks flared against the black, and tiny clouds of ice glittered before dispersing. Mars spun below them, silent witness to its own wounds. Duran watched the pattern take shape on the heads-up display. This was the window he had waited for. Mark their rotation arcs. Prepare the first volley. Across the belt, mining arms pivoted in unison. Asteroid drones adjusted their trajectories, quiet as shadows. Their tungsten payloads, dense, dull, and simple, aligned with the moving targets that had no reason to expect death from so far away. Every coordinate had been calculated, refined over months of simulations. Stage 1 locked, the weapons officer confirmed, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple. Awaiting your signal. Duran inhaled through his teeth, tasting the dry tang of the bunker's air. He glanced once at the display of Mars, at the shattered yards and the silent bodies drifting in widening arcs. This was their requiem. Release the rods. The asteroid drones obeyed without ceremony. Invisible to the naked eye, tungsten rods launched into darkness, accelerated by magnetic rails. They traveled faster than a rifle bullet, crossing the gulf in seconds, guided by predictive algorithms that turned alien arrogance into a fatal flaw. The first Velari destroyer died before its sensors registered the threat. A spike of light erupted from its midsection as a rod punched clean through the hull, breaking the ship in two. Atmosphere vented in violent streams, scattering crew and fragments into space. Another strike followed, and another, each impact a silent burst of lethal geometry. Direct hits! The weapons officer couldn't keep the strain from his voice. 3 confirmed kills, 2 more crippled. On the display, the fleet's formation fractured. Escort ships veered off, course confused, their own debris fields suddenly hazardous. The skirmisher drones pivoted wildly, seeking threats they couldn't detect. They've stopped advancing, the sensor chief said, almost in disbelief. They're hesitating. Let them, Duran murmured, jaw tightening. Now they know Sul isn't empty. In orbit over Mars, the first act of the trap had sprung, and the invaders finally understood that humanity was not frozen in fear, but waiting with a blade they never saw coming. The kill box was awake, and the Armada's arrogance had just cost them their first ships. Stage 2. Bring the ghosts online, Duran Voss commanded, his voice low but firm, echoing through the bunker like a trigger pulled. The crew in Aegis Spire moved as a single organism, the light of the laser plasma displays painting their faces in sharp contrast. Mars's orbit glimmered with fresh scars, the Velari fleet holding just beyond the broken shipyards, unsure for the first time. On the outer edges of the system, derelict freighters stirred from months of programmed hibernation. Their gutted interiors carried no crew, only reflective panels and signal emitters designed to mimic the heat and spectrum signatures of fully armed warships. As they rotated into position, they shimmered like predators, lurking in the dark, broadcasting whispers of false strength into every band the Velari scanners could read. Ghost Fleet deployed, the tactical officer reported, his throat dry. They'll see what we want them to see in 30 seconds. Duran's eyes locked on the heads-up display as the alien formation responded exactly as predicted. The white glyphs representing Velari ships tightened, carriers drawing in their escorts nudging closer to one another. The aliens were afraid of empty space now, every speck of debris a possible threat. Their skirmisher drones swirled out like hornets, forming rotating shields around the core formation. On the secondary feed, the first freighter drifted into visual contact, its reflective hull catching Sol's light. To alien optics, it looked alive and armed. 2 destroyers adjusted course, wary of the Phantom. Duran felt a grim satisfaction tighten in his chest. Fear was finally working for them. Skirmishers are chasing decoys, the sensor chief observed, his fingers hovering over the console. They're scattering into tighter patterns to guard the carriers. Good, Duran said. That gives us corridors. The next command went through the secure network. Automated launchers hidden on dormant orbital frames activated silently, flinging cold-launched projectiles along pre-mapped paths. The weapons were simple, dense rods and fragments given terrifying velocity, but combined with Epitaph's debris manipulation algorithms, they turned Mars' orbit into a killing ground. The first Valari cruiser learned the lesson hard. A drifting fragment from the destroyed shipyard, nudged by a time thruster, veered into its flank. A split second later, a tungsten rod drove through the weakened plating. A muted flash blossomed on the display, and the ship's icon winked out. "Direct strike," the weapons officer confirmed, his voice caught between disbelief and awe. Cruiser vented, breaking apart. Another escort clipped a cluster of shards that had been shifted hours earlier by a silent drone. The ship spun, overcorrected, and collided with a skirmisher unit. Sparks scattered in the void as both became wreckage, expanding the field of lethal debris. In the command bunker, the air smelled of cold steel and recycled filters. Sweat gathered on brows as the room absorbed the unfolding chaos. Every strike was a small reprieve, yet every passing second reminded Duran that the clock was ticking on their advantage. A new feed appeared on the right panel. It was a live transmission from a Martian maintenance outpost they hadn't been able to fully clear. 6 engineers had been left in an emergency shelter, huddled in partial gravity with nothing but pressure doors between them and the fight. Their faces were drawn and pale under emergency lights. One man mouthed something toward the camera. Duran couldn't hear the words, but he could read them. "Are we going to make it?" The commander swallowed hard. He couldn't answer. "Commander," the comms officer interrupted, "aliens are shifting tactics." On the display, the once cohesive fleet began deploying wide-spectrum jamming pulses. Blue arcs rippled across the map, blanketing sections of space in noise. Reflective decoys flickered, their false signals overridden. Skirmishers zeroed in on the freighters and opened fire, tearing the first ghost ship into tumbling fragments. "They've started burning our phantoms," the tactical officer said, trying to keep his voice steady. Duran exhaled slowly, the recycled air dry against his throat. "I expected this. They've seen the pattern now." His mind raced as he studied the shifting formations. The fleet was adapting faster than in simulations. The ambush window was closing. The bunker shook faintly as an orbital fragment drifted into a distant station, jarring the camera feed. Dust fell from the ceiling in a thin haze, catching the display light. The crew tensed, but no one spoke. "Count remaining decoys," Duran ordered. 5 active, 3 compromised, 2 destroyed," the weapons officer answered. The aliens had taken their first real losses and were already cutting through the illusion. Humanity's advantage, deception, surprise, misdirection, was slipping with every second the enemy recalibrated. Duran's hand rested on the console, the smooth surface cold under his palm. His jaw tightened as he watched the enemy fleet roll into its next formation. Jammers sweeping, skirmishers tearing through debris like wolves through brush. The trap had worked, but its teeth were blunting. Above Mars, the kill box had roared to life. Now, with the ghost burning and the debris field disrupted, humanity stood on the edge of exposure. One wrong move and the Valari would see exactly how small Earth's true defenses were. The commander didn't look away from the display. "Stage 2 complete," he said quietly to himself as much as to the room. "Stage 3 had better be ready." "Fleet is fracturing," the sensor officer called, his voice clipped with tension. "Valari escorts are breaking off to sweep the debris lanes. Main carriers are spreading into an open arc." Duran Voss stared at the laser plasma displays, their blue-white light bathing the dim bunker in a ghostly glow. Mars floated scarred and silent on one side of the screen, while the alien fleet unfurled across the orbital map like a net being cast. The shift was exactly what he'd been waiting for. "They're doing what we wanted," Duran said, his tone flat. "They think tightening up was the mistake. They want clear fire lanes now." The fleet's overconfidence had taken a mortal step. By widening their formation to avoid collisions, they had exposed their flanks, and Epitaph's final blade was ready. Duran keyed in the command with a finger that no longer trembled. "All batteries, stage 3, he said. Send the stones home. Across the asteroid belt, silent weapons woke. Mass driver stations that had masqueraded as abandoned mining rigs for months now spun up their launch rails. In darkness, asteroids whispered movement as embedded projectiles ripped free, catapulted by stored magnetic energy. Dense kinetic slugs, each the weight of a main battle tank, leapt into pre-mapped trajectories with lethal indifference. Rods away, the weapons officer confirmed, sweat tracing down his temple. Time to impact, 47 seconds. The bunker felt as if everyone had stopped breathing. The air was cold, tinged with the sterile tang of recycled filters and the faint musk of human fear. Duran's eyes stayed fixed on the heads-up display as arcs of projected impact paths glimmered. Each line represented a moment where months of preparation would either justify the blood already spilled or fail spectacularly. Impact came in a cascade of light. A Velari cruiser at the edge of the fleet bloomed with an eruption of vapor and shrapnel as a tungsten slug punched through its centerline. The ship folded in on itself, venting crew and machinery into the void. A heartbeat later, a second strike hit an escort frigate, snapping its spine and sending the two halves into a slow, tumbling death spiral. 3 hits confirmed, the sensor officer said, voice trembling with adrenaline. Wait, 5 now. 2 more detonations on the far flank. Cheers didn't rise in Aegis Spire. The bunker only absorbed the sound of staccato reports and the low hiss of air handlers. For every alien icon winking out, humanity's cost followed. A side monitor flashed red as the eerie first human orbital station, an old communications hub, took a direct hit from retaliatory fire. Station Alpha 3 is gone, the comms officer whispered. His hands tightened on the console, knuckles pale. A second station flared on the display, its skeletal frame disintegrating under a spray of railgun fire. Debris streaked across Mars' shadowed curve. A third station followed within minutes, its last transmission a silent burst of telemetry before the feed vanished into static. Duran didn't flinch. He felt the losses, each one a stone added to the weight he already carried, but he couldn't allow it to slow the plan. Those crews had known the risks. Their deaths were the last purchases in a war fought with patience and misdirection instead of brute force. Commander, the tactical officer said, voice low, Stage 3 has the Velari reeling. They're trying to converge their carriers for mutual coverage, but the debris field is tearing their timing apart. Duran nodded once. Good. That's the moment we need. Begin blindside. A soft chime confirmed the command had reached the farthest edge of Sol. Beyond Neptune's orbit, in the cold reaches of the Kuiper Belt, 10 freighters stirred. Their shapes were ungainly and patched, more like drifters than weapons, but each carried a core of tungsten rods and a cluster of decoy emitters. Months ago, automated tugs had towed them into position, hiding them among ice fragments and slow-turning rock. Now the freighters woke to life. Gravity assists plotted months in advance began their chain. One by one, the ships flung themselves onto escape trajectories, using planetary momentum to hurl them toward the Velari home system. They were slow vengeance wrapped in steel, each carrying the potential to strip orbitals and cripple infrastructure without ever firing a shot. Blindside freighters away, the weapons officer said, all 10 reporting nominal trajectory. Confirmed decoy activation, Duran said, eyes on the secondary display. Decoys live. Anyone looking will see a dozen phantom signatures along with the real payloads. They'll spend weeks chasing ghosts before they realize what's inbound. For the first time in hours, Duran allowed himself a shallow breath that didn't feel like stone. Months of hidden labor had left humanity with only one strike to make the enemy bleed where it hurt most. If the Velari ever traced the freighters before they arrived, they would have time to intercept. If not, Earth would speak through wreckage on a distant sky. On the main display, the alien fleet convulsed in reaction to Stage 3's success. Destroyers scrambled to realign, carriers drifted into overlapping shields, and the arcs of their counterfire became more desperate. They were overcommitted now, too far in to retreat cleanly, and partially sensor-blind from the jamming, decoys, and their own debris chaos. The command bunker felt colder than ever, though sweat clung to the back of every neck. Duran watched the icons dance and vanish, his face unreadable but his heart pounding. He had always known war in space would not be about heroics. It would be about choices that left you wondering how much of your soul had been spent buying a single day of survival. "Commander," the sensor chief murmured, "they know now. They've realized Sul isn't a battleground, it's a snare." Duran didn't answer. He simply stared at the glowing icons of the alien fleet, knowing the game was far from finished, but the board finally belonged to him. "Ground batteries are green across the board," the tactical officer reported, his voice brittle from hours of strain. "Atmospheric corridors are clear." "Fire," Duranvos said. His order was steady, but every muscle in his body felt coiled and raw. From the hidden launch sites buried in mountains and deep-sea silos, missiles surged into the sky. Flames lit the night over Earth's oceans and deserts, contrails slicing through the high atmosphere like burning spears. Each missile carried the guidance data calculated days ago, plotted against the fractured Velari formations above. On the command bunker's heads-up displays, they appeared as streams of green light rising from the blue planet, curving into the black toward the enemy fleet. "Multiple launches confirmed," the sensor officer said, eyes flicking across cascading telemetry. "Time to intercept, under 90 seconds. In orbit, the Velari carriers were scrambling to close their screens, their tight defensive geometry ruined by debris and the chaos of Stage 3. The alien fleet had bled too long. Their escorts were scattered, many disabled or drifting, and the remaining destroyers were trying to stitch a shield around their larger carriers. The first missile wave struck like a hammer. A carrier on the fleet's lower flank vanished in a burst of expanding fire, fragments spinning off into the kill box humanity had turned Mars' orbit into. Shockwaves rippled through the display as the missiles found gaps between failing escorts. One missile drove through a carrier's forward section, igniting its reactor. The resulting explosion scattered molten fragments across the orbital lanes. In Aegis Spire, the crew exhaled in a ragged chorus, some clenching fists, others pressing foreheads against their knuckles. Duran's gaze remained fixed on the screen. "Confirm hits," he said. "4 carriers destroyed, Commander," the sensor chief said, voice tight with disbelief. "2 more venting and spinning out. Their formation is gone." The aliens fought back with the stubbornness of cornered predators. Rearguard destroyers pivoted, firing volleys of energy weapons and kinetic shells toward the remaining human orbital platforms. One platform took a direct strike, its structural spine snapping in two. Crew pods tumbled away, some igniting in brief, hopeless flares. Another platform disintegrated moments later, and a camera feed captured a fleeting human moment. A crewman in a suit clinging to a railing as the structure broke apart, then vanishing into the spinning cloud of metal and dust. Duran closed his eyes for half a second, the image etching itself into memory. This wasn't triumph, it was survival paid for in red. "Second missile wave entering intercept zone," the weapons officer said, voice trembling from exhaustion and the gravity of what they were doing. The missiles curved through the pre-cleared atmospheric paths, guided by the predictive models of Epitaph. Another carrier erupted into flame, shedding fragments of hull that turned into fresh hazards for any ship trying to maneuver. One destroyer tried to intercept 3 incoming warheads, taking out 2 before the third tore through its side and sent it spinning into a debris cloud. "Rearguard is making a stand," the tactical officer muttered. "They're burning themselves to cover the retreat." On the display, icons representing the remaining Velari carriers began sliding toward the edge of the system, leaving their dying escorts behind. Half the fleet was already gone, destroyed or drifting, and the rest was abandoning Mars' orbit in a broken, limping arc. Humanity had turned Sul into a slaughterhouse, but the cost had been carved into the void alongside the enemy's losses. A deep silence settled over the bunker for a moment, broken only by the soft clicks of keys and the hum of circulating air. Duran's hand rested on the edge of the display, his fingers cold. He had no words for his officers, no speeches of glory or vengeance. He had delivered what he promised: survival through cunning and blood, not through heroism. "Commander," the COEM's officer said quietly, "we have confirmation. Remaining Velari ships are leaving the system. Trajectory, retreating toward their own space." Duran nodded once. His chest felt heavy, as if every lost crewman had placed a hand there. "Mark them," he said. "Log every hull that flees. We'll remember who ran and who burned." The final images of the battle played across the screens. Earth's orbit was a graveyard now. Shattered platforms spun slowly, reflecting distant sunlight. Debris from Valari and human ships mingled in lethal halos around Mars and in the inner lanes toward Earth. Rescue craft began to emerge from hiding, their beacon lights glinting like candles among tombstones. Duran exhaled slowly, the air dry against his tongue. He thought of the engineers on the Martian shelter, the miners who had left their home knowing they might never see another dawn, the orbital crews who had sat at their posts until their stations became shrapnel. There was no cheer in the room. Survival had been earned, but it had the taste of rust and smoke. The sensor feed zoomed out one last time, showing Sol's inner system in static lines of wreckage and drifting hulls. More than half the Valari fleet had been annihilated or disabled. The survivors fleeing with the knowledge that they had not broken humanity. They had awakened it. Duran's voice was barely above a whisper. "We hold the system, but this war isn't over." And above Earth, the silent orbit bore witness to that truth. An endless ring of debris, a warning, and a monument all at once. "Commander, we've intercepted Valari transmissions," the comms officer said, his voice steady but tinged with the kind of awe that only comes from witnessing history. Darren Voss turned from the observation deck of Aegis Spire. Beyond the thick glass, Earth's orbit still bore the scars of the battle. Shattered stations drifted in slow spirals. Fragments of enemy hulls glinted like fractured stars. Recovery ships moved methodically through the field, their floodlights cutting cones into the black. Crews in orange suits worked in silence, tethered to the debris they were clearing. "Put it on main feed," Duran said. The heads-up display flickered, and the room fell quiet as alien data scrolled across translated overlays. 5 months of waiting had ended in a single report. Garbled Valari tactical chatter, panicked command pings, then a final signal burst that left the room in an electric silence. "Homeworld orbit compromised," the sensor chief read aloud. "Orbital rings destroyed. Multiple fleets recalled from frontier sectors. They're not sending reinforcements anywhere. They're digging in." Another feed appeared, intercepted visual telemetry of their distant system. It showed their once proud defense platforms, now fractured and tumbling, the rings of wreckage reflecting their sun like chains of broken glass. For a moment, nobody in the room moved. The silent satisfaction was heavy, and beneath it, something colder. The knowledge that humanity's hand had reached across the stars without ever leaving home. Darren gripped the edge of the console. His voice was low. "Operation Blindside is complete." The words carried weight because he knew what they had cost. He had counted the dead on Mars, the orbital crews who had stayed at their posts until the stations came apart. He had watched the recovery manifests, every name tagged with a simple code: located, missing, confirmed lost. The victory felt earned but jagged. The tactical officer approached quietly. "They aren't responding. No declaration, no counterstrike, just silence." "Fear," Duran said. "They understand now." He turned back to the glass, letting his gaze drift over the graveyard orbit. Pieces of alien hull rotated slowly, edges scorched. A cracked human panel floated past, part of a solar wing that would never catch light again. The floodlights of the recovery ships reminded him of candles placed in the dark, honoring the dead with every careful maneuver. A junior officer hesitated near the console. "Sir, we could strike again. Blindside proved we can hit them where they live. We could finish it." Duran shook his head slowly. "We don't need to invade their skies to make our point. They saw what followed their fleet into Sol. They'll see it every day above their homeworld now. Wreckage is a better teacher than fire." His words landed like steel in the quiet room. Humanity's power was not in conquest but in consequence. Sol had become a message carved in orbital debris. Approach uninvited, and your own skies will become your memorial. Outside, the recovery crews went on with their work. A small drone nudged a drifting panel into the net of a tug, sparks flickering as contact sensors engaged. The process was slow and methodical, but it felt right. Life after battle demanded patience. Every survivor earned the chance to see a world unbroken. The comms officer glanced toward Duran. Galactic chatter has shifted. Neighboring systems are monitoring the Velari. No one's moving against us. They're waiting to see if the enemy can even stand again. Duran's reflection on the glass looked older than the man who had walked into this bunker months ago. Lines traced under his eyes, and the tension in his shoulders had settled into permanence. He thought of the miners who had loaded the last freighter before evacuation, the orbital engineers waving to a camera they knew might outlive them. He thought of the silence that followed each burst of light in the battle above Mars. "This is our line," he said finally, not loud but certain. "We defend what's ours. They've learned enough." The bunker seemed to exhale with him. For the first time in months, the weight in the air lifted. Outside, Earth rotated in its quiet rhythm, unaware that its continued freedom had been secured not by glory, but by those willing to do the work that would never make headlines. The comms panel flashed one last intercepted signal, abrupt, fragmented, translated into a phrase that chilled and satisfied in equal measure. "Cease Sol operations. Return all fleets. Loss unacceptable." Darn let the words settle. They were not a treaty, but they were surrender enough. Humanity would not chase them across the stars. It didn't need to. The message had been written in orbit and in memory. As the shift changed and night settled over the surface far below, he took one final look at the wreckage haloing Earth and Mars. It would take years to clear, decades to repair, but it was the price of sovereignty paid in full. He turned to his crew and said what they all felt. "The Armada entered Sol," he said, voice calm, "and now only Wreckage circles their own world." The room was silent, but the truth needed no applause. If this story gripped you, make sure to subscribe to Stellar HFY. Leave a comment with the moment that hit you hardest. And if you enjoyed this journey, share it with someone who loves to see humanity rise from the edge of extinction.